Hello there. Welcome to No Extra Words, One Person Search for Story. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. This is Season 2, Book Pairings. So we're breaking format a little bit today, because I looked for several things to pair A Wrinkle in Time with, but at the end of the day, with so much going on around this book, and wanting to kind of do a deeper dive into it, I decided to let it stand alone. So I'm really pairing it up with its own adaptations today, and how it's evolved through the years, really pairing it up with itself. The movie is out at the time that I'm recording this. I have not seen it. It's recently out. It's getting, I would say, overall quite good reviews. Not perfect, but nothing ever is. And I'm going to have a guest stop by in a couple minutes to talk about rereading and revisiting A Wrinkle in Time, and, you know, how we saw it then and how we see it now. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce the book and give you a little bit of a background on it, and talk to you a little bit about Madeline Wrinkle as well. A Wrinkle in Time was published in 1962. It's the first in what is now called the Time Quintet series. There would be eventually 5 of them. The last one, which is An Acceptable Time, was released in 1989. So this was a long-running series. Took a long time to get all of them out. And it was not Madeline Wrinkle's first book. It was not her first success either, but it became and has remained her most enduring and lasting work, although a lot of what she wrote is still in print, for sure. Madeline Wrinkle was born in New York City and spent her teenage years in Europe. She went to a Swiss boarding school and lost her father at 17. She wrote first for adults. She got a bachelor's degree in English, and she wrote novels for adults and came to some success. But it was sort of like her first novel, which is The Small Rain, was very successful. Second novel, not so much. And as time went on, she ended up going through sort of a funk where most things weren't selling. And she managed to sell another adult book in the late 50s, but she sort of transitioned slowly into being someone who wrote for children. Her first book that is really thought of as being for younger readers was And Both Were Young in 1949, but she really sort of made her name as a writer for children and found her footing in her writing career in 1960 with Meet the Austins. She wrote several books about the Austins, including a picture book on Advent that is in my Christmas book collection. And the Austins was really seen as groundbreaking because it talked so honestly about death, which was rare for a children's book at that time. And in 1962, she came out with A Wrinkle in Time. Her own children were the first readers. She had 3 children, and she would read them drafts of her story while she worked on it. Wrinkle herself was an only child, but she had 3 children. And as with many successful books, A Wrinkle in Time was rejected all over the place before it finally found its home. And it is, I think it's safe to say, a one-of-a-kind book, quite groundbreaking in its day. It did win the Newbery Medal in 1963. The book, of course, deals with Meg Murray, who is one of my favorite heroines to ever wear glasses. Meg is widely considered the dunce of her very, very smart scientific family, and with a little help of 3 eccentric women who live next door, she and her genius 6-year-old brother, Charles Wallace, and a random neighbor named Calvin O'Keefe go on an adventure through time and space to rescue her father, who has been missing for some time. That's basically the basics of A Wrinkle in Time. We're going to go in depth into a conversation about this book in a little bit, and at that point I will warn you that we're going to hit some spoilers, so you are fine in this section, but if you have not yet read this book and want to, you're going to want to skip out in the conversation I'm going to have in just a couple minutes. A Wrinkle in Time has been celebrated, but of course, as with most books for children, especially most groundbreaking books for children, it ran into its fair share of controversy. It was banned and challenged in the 1960s for being anti-Christian and dealing with the occult, which probably really surprised Madeline L'Engle, who was actually a pretty religious person. Faith was central to her life. She was an Episcopalian. She believed in Christian universalism, which is the idea that everyone will ultimately be saved by God. And she wrote on faith a number of times. One of the things I did not know and found out when I was researching for this episode is that she was a librarian and writer in residence at St. John the Divine in New York City, which is a place I have been. I got to sing there as part of the festival choir in November 2016 when my choir and I were in New York City singing at Carnegie Hall. It's a beautiful space, intentionally unfinished Gothic cathedral near Columbia University, and it has America's answer to Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner in it, and it's a beautiful, inspiring space of faith. And she worked there for a long time, decades. A very religious woman. And as we're going to talk about in a couple minutes, it is interesting when you read criticisms of this book today, there are many people who find it too religious because it does have some reference to faith in it as well. So, an interesting lady, Madeline L'Engle. She wrote for adults as well. She wrote poetry as well. And she wrote really all the way through her life. And her last book was published posthumously. So, a prolific writer, an inspiring writer for our time. I have seen only one adaptation of Wrinkle in Time, and I actually love it. There is a graphic novel edition which came out in, I think, 2010, 12, somewhere in that range. At the time that it was released, I was working as a librarian at a school serving kids with dyslexia and related reading challenges. And so A Wrinkle in Time was something a lot of them couldn't access because of its reading level and depth of language. And one of the things I loved about the graphic novel adaptation is it brings some of the original language in. So it makes it accessible to people who have a harder time reading, but it does not dumb down the language or the science. And it's beautiful, beautifully drawn book. So I'm not completely against adaptations of the book, but I think we all who have special relationships with books get a little bit nervous when we see big screen adaptations of some of our favorites. So the movie is in theaters now. I would love to hear from you on all of our social media channels what you are thinking of it and what role this book and movie has played in your life. But now I'm going to invite a very special guest into studio with me to talk more in depth about our reread of A Wrinkle in Time. I brought back one of my all-time favorite podcast guests. Do you want to tell the nice people who you are?
My name's Josh. I'm the husband of this podcaster who is doing this podcast.
And once again, we are sharing a microphone, so it is, I feel like this is a test of our relationship every time we do this. I wanted to bring Josh in because both he and I just reread A Wrinkle in Time within the last 3 weeks, would you say?
Yeah.
After having not read it for a really, really long time. And I wanted to kind of talk about this book, but also that sort of active rereading and visiting something from your childhood, especially since Josh, my personal live-in guest, is not a librarian, doesn't spend as much time with children's books as I do, and I think would have a different perspective. So thank you for coming to talk to me on mic about this book.
Oh, no problem.
So do you want to start by saying what, if anything, did you remember about the book? What, if any, kind of relationship did you have with the book as a kid when you read it the first time?
I would say that I know I read this as a kid, but I had basically no recollection of it other than stuff about tesseracts. That's it.
And you know more science than I do, so this is something I've always wondered, is how good is the science in this book?
It's a science fiction story. There isn't a lot of hard science in this. There's just this, concept of various dimensions being talked about and the ability to fold space or create a wrinkle in time, as it were, to jump from one place to another without, having to, travel at high speeds or whatever, is a fairly standard sci-fi trope. But I think at the time it was fairly interesting. Like, this is, what year was this published?
62.
Yeah, so I mean, it hadn't been really explored too much, I don't think, in the realm of sci-fi.
So, in a way, this book is kind of groundbreaking.
I think it's groundbreaking in a number of ways. Someone on the internet is going to know, you're going to be able to point out 4 dozen books that talked about folding space, prior to 1962. But it's certainly been a well-trod idea since then. And they're all explained exactly the same way, by the way. Like, they'll fold a piece of paper and stick a pencil through it, or whatever, or use the example in the book with the cloth of the dress and picturing an ant and all that sort of stuff.
And every edition I've ever seen of this book has illustrations in that part where they're describing the science. Yeah. So I think that's standard. And you and I have talked about this before. When something is iconic, and I think it's fair to say A Wrinkle in Time's iconic, it's really hard to tell what is a trope and what is just, it's been imitated so many times because it is iconic. And so it feels old and well-trod, even though it may not have been in 1962. So were you a big sci-fi reader as a kid?
Yeah, I read a lot of young adult sci-fi stuff. And I think sci-fi is still kind of the genre I come back to most often when I do, read stuff these days.
And you are, in your life, an engineer, so that makes sense, because science is something that you... And your kind of science. I don't know how much you want to say about what it is you do, but your kind of science.
Computer science is not nearly as interesting as quantum physics.
That's fair. But let's just say you dabble in science more than I do.
I dabble.
Okay, so how much rereading do you do of books that you read a long time ago? Is that something you do a lot, or every now and then? Are there certain books you come back to multiple times? What role does rereading play in your world?
I don't know. It's the sort of thing I'll do from time to time. There are some old standards that I like to come back to that are just, it's just kind of a feel-good popcorn sort of nostalgia trip, I guess.
Like?
I like rereading Daniel Pinkwater books. I read those as a kid, and though that guy's just got such an interesting imagination behind his stuff, and it's they're fun because I feel like they're all about kids, but they don't talk down to kids.
Yes.
And even as an adult, they're just so weird. Like, I think that's just, part of the fun of reading those.
I feel like Daniel Pinkwater's really underread in this era. I think it's because the most recent editions were off-putting. They're like those 4 books in one set.
Yeah.
And for a kid,
I bought both of, there's 2 of them. One has 4, one that has 5, and I couldn't find the books individually, most of them.
They're not in print anymore. So if anybody listening, if you have a teenager in your life who's like, what would you say, in that kind of 12 to 14 range, or maybe even a little younger?
Yeah, 11 to 14, I would say that, I mean, even older, really, but obviously, surly teenagers aren't going to be as big into it. They're just fun.
If you have, especially a boy, but really any teenager in that range, give them Daniel Pinkwater. I love his picture books, too. He did The Big Orange Splot, which is an awesome picture book. So anyway, so you have certain books you come back to, but this wasn't one of them. So you hadn't read it since you were... How old?
I think actually I read this maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay.
I have a recollection of reading it then.
So this was maybe your third read through in your life.
Possibly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you did it because I made you.
Yeah, I did. That's correct.
Well, and I should say, as of this recording, we have not seen this movie. I think we have aspirations to see this movie. We have a 3-year-old, so getting both of us out of the house at the same time to see a movie is a little bit of a planning issue. But I think part of it was we wanted to read the book and then see the movie. And Josh knows that I have very mixed feelings about this movie, and he's been comforting me and talking me down.
She has mixed feelings about every novelization or movieization of any book that she holds dear, which is understandable, I guess.
So, since maybe this is not a book that's as important in your world, what would you say your reaction was when we first started to see trailers for this movie?
It looked a little too polished for me. Like, it just looks like another Hollywood blockbuster, special effects and big celebrities and all that kind of thing movie. But other than that, I didn't really have much of an opinion. Like I said, I don't have a deep amount of recollection about the book. So just looking at the trailers, it's like, oh, okay, I recognize what this character is supposed to be, but it's not breaking my heart or anything here, because I don't know. I don't really remember.
So you wouldn't say you have a strong attachment to seeing or not seeing.
This isn't one I have an emotional attachment to, so no.
Okay.
I did read recently that they're making a movie adaptation of John Belair's A House with a Clock in Its Walls, and that's got Jack Black in it, and I just can't see it. Like, that just instantly kind of makes me upset. But I'll reserve judgment till the movie's actually out, and we'll see if it's any good.
Do you generally have strong feelings about adaptations of books? That you're more of a movie guy too than I am. So
no, not so much books. But remakes, definitely. I'll look at the constant remakes that they're putting out there, and it's just like, well, the original was good, why bother? But you know what? I'm trying to be less of a curmudgeon about these sorts of things, and failing, but I'm working on it.
So I'm putting a giant spoiler alert on this conversation that we're going to have about the book. If you have not read it and want to, this is probably the time to press stop. But, because I'm actually going to start with the end, because the thing that I remember before I made you reread this book is, you said, because you were asking what I think of A Wrinkle in Time, and I was telling you I adored this book as a child, but haven't read it in a really, really, really long time, so I'm interested to see how it holds up. And you said you felt like, from your most recent reread of it, that the end felt really, really abrupt. Like, it went from this big moment of, like, conflict to all of a sudden they're just home and that just happened. And so, maybe when you talk about your reflections on the reread, we start at the end. How did you feel about the conclusion of this book on the reread?
Well, like you said, it still feels kind of abrupt, but I would say that it is something I had forgotten. One of the things I remembered is that the ending of the book was abrupt, because we had that conversation before I had actually done the reread.
Yeah.
But what I had forgotten is basically the entire book is kind of abrupt like that. Like, in a modern book, you would have a lot more time spent filling in background and details. Like, you have a character like Meg who's, she's a troubled teenager who has a lot of things going on, and she's emotional. And in today's books, you'd have like a chapter about, all the crap she was going through at school and her feelings and all of these things. And everything in this is just kind of assumes that we know what's going on.
It's short on angst, which I think is one of the things I like about it. There's not pages and pages of Meg sort of whining about her world.
This isn't the Hunger Games.
It's not
trilogy.
Not
here.
Even a little bit.
So the ending is kind of it kind of just tosses you. It's like Meg saves Charles Wallace and comes back. They're back home and everything's great. And then, Mrs. Who, Mrs. What, and Mrs. Which just like, we got to go now. And then the book's over. It's abrupt, but again, it's the same sort of thing that goes through the entire book. I mean, the character of Calvin is introduced in about a half a page, and all of a sudden it's just like, I'm going to hang out with you guys now. And and go on a crazy Goonie adventure with you through time and space. And
I love the little, to me, stylistically, that's one of the things I like about this book. And I like the little moments where it's like, there's just this tiny hint of romance where they're in this dramatic moment and Calvin grabs her and kisses her, and then that's done. And I don't think the romance continues until you get to the next book.
There's no dramatic love triangle. There's no...
And when it comes to Meg being a troubled teenager, you just get these little moments that tell you who she is. Like, there's one scene where she's helping... I can't remember if it's Calvin. I think it must be Calvin. She's helping him with his math.
Yeah, it's Calvin.
And she's supposed to be this big dunce in school. That's the thing, is she's the dumb one in this family. And she instantly solves his math problem because she realizes she can do it her way. And you get this hint that this is a person who's probably too smart for her peer group and too smart for her teachers. And her response to that has been to shut down in school. But you don't have pages and pages describing every interaction with a teacher that's led up to that moment.
Yeah, well, and I feel like I agree with that. You don't necessarily need all this, but there's some things in the book that are just kind of taken for granted. Like, it's just and not really explained in any depth. Like, everyone in this family is geniuses, and the parents are scientists, and they live in a house that isn't described at all, except that it has a lab in it. Right. And it's just like, science. There's science happening here, and it isn't even discussed. It's just like, science. All these kids are geniuses. Charles Wallace can read minds. Any questions? It's a little bit of explanation about, Charles Wallace, for example, would maybe help a little bit, because it's just like, the mom's just like, he can read your mind, whatnot. We're totally cool with that. We just expect that he's an extremely bright child, and so when that happens, you can just, it's just a little weird. And I like that, but it's also, just like, why is this not elaborated on? No one seems to bat an eye at any of this stuff. Least of all Kelvin, who comes into the story, and it's just like, yeah, we're in another dimension now, cool. We just teleported across space, awesome. Here we are.
You sort of get the feeling that for Calvin, he's been so ignored by his own family, and they could not possibly care less about him. So being in this family who accepts him as weird as they are, it's just like, okay, I'm in for whatever. Like, can we talk characters for just a second? Like, do these characters read real to you? Were there any that drive you crazy? Were there any that you wanted to have more information on? Did they seem like they were fully developed?
Again, everything's kind of abrupt, and you learn more about these characters kind of as you go along, but the precociousness of Charles Wallace is a little weird and again underexplained. I like the character of Meg, but her character arc is like a constant level of being whiny teenager, and then, oh wait, I get it, and then problem solved. Like, oh wait, parents can't solve my problems, I'm no longer whiny.
But isn't there an element if that's what teenager life is like?
Maybe. I don't know. I never went through a whiny teenager phase.
I am asking your mother.
If
you ever went through
that.
A whiny teenager phase.
I was fairly atypical.
And Charles Wallace, I think to me as a child, Charles Wallace read as creepy. Like, he, here's this sort of like zombie kid who can read your mind. And I think that on the reread, Charles Wallace gets a little more nuance. And I think on the reread, I also realized how little he actually is. Like, this is a kindergartner. It's a genius, weird, like, high-talking kindergartner. But he's little. Yeah. And that helped a little bit, like, alleviate some of his creepiness. Because he does get creepy. He gets creepy before he's actually creepy.
Yeah.
Because there's the scene where he's possessed and he's literally creepy. Yeah. And I think, for me, the reread the change worked better on that. So, any other characters that you love or hate in this book?
The 3W people, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Which.
Okay, so can we talk about them for a minute in the movie context? Because again, I have not seen this movie. But they are all over the previews, because that's where the big stars are, sure, right? Yeah. And to me, it's like, the point of these three characters when you first meet them is that they're pretty frumpy and scary looking and whatever, and then they become
or completely invisible.
And then they become these majestic, magical creatures when they take their true form. So if you start out by being Oprah, you kind of have nowhere to go. Like, I'm not one of the things that this movie's been making big press about is this sort of colorblind casting, and Meg is biracial and all of that. And I think for me, it's less so probably having an African American Mrs. whatever one she is. It's more of that she's Oprah.
Yeah, it's a little weird. I think that's a typical problem, though, with this, is that you can't, if you cast someone who's just plain looking, or just, not beautiful, then, it's not a Hollywood movie. I don't know.
It's why Emma Watson's too pretty to be Hermione Granger. It's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Of the sort of mythical characters, do you have a favorite? Like, the places they land when they see the happy medium and those folks. Do you have a planet you want to know more about? Like, one you want to know the backstory on?
I feel like, that's a good question. That's, for me, my mind always go, I don't know how to pronounce the name of the planet, Kamitsats or whatever, where all the evil's going on. That's the sort of thing where you get kind of just a brief snapshot of what's going on there, and it would be interesting to, from my mind, I keep thinking about, well, like, how does this work? Like, so this planet has been taken over by, it, or the what is it, the black thing? Yeah, that's what they call it. What does that mean? I mean, obviously everyone's in sync or whatnot, but what do they do? Like, what are they doing this for? What's the ultimate, like, why are they being controlled to do these sorts of things? So this kind of more of a background of, like, what is a planet that's been taken over by the darkness? What's it about beyond everyone, operating in sync with each other, and having no real mind of their own.
I will say that scene where the kids are jumping rope and bouncing balls, to me as a child, that was one of the, like, creepiest scenes of literature I ever read. It was so vivid in my head, that little boy who gets taken away because he drops his ball. There is something just so viscerally creepy about that scene. But it is interesting, you don't see, like you said, you don't see the bigger picture.
You don't get told the bigger picture. You're just, everything that's involved with this is just, oh, there's this evil force and it's starting to take everything over, and it's like, well, why? Which is never fully addressed. So, I'd like to see more detail on that sort of thing, but, it's...
What did you think of the religious aspect of the book?
I thought it was, an interesting idea that, that, for example, Jesus has been part of fighting this thing, along with, apparently, Einstein and famous philosophers and artists like Leonardo da Vinci. It's just like, okay, well...
There's a scene where all of a sudden there's some religion that just gets dropped in. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, there's the scene where they talk about how Jesus is one of the freedom fighters or whatever.
Yeah, there's that, and later in the book, one of the three mysterious ladies gives Meg a reading from, I can't remember what chapter and verse of the Bible, but it's about the foolish person confounding the wise, and it's an interesting parable. It's an interesting addition to the book. It also makes me wonder how religion fits into this gigantic universe that apparently exists.
Right. One of the things that in my limited research I've done on this book, is that I see at the time that it was published, it was very controversial, as a lot of children's books are when they break ground. And one of the things that people accuse it of being is anti-Christian and promoting the occult. Well, and when you read reviews of it now, a lot of people are uncomfortable with the Christianity that's in it. It sort of cuts both ways. Like, you can be mad at it because it's not religious enough, or because it's too religious.
I don't feel like it was too religious. It was interesting, and I feel like it thematically fits. And yeah, the people who would have discounted at the time as being occult, I mean, that's
kind of ridiculous.
That's pretty common. That seems to be a theme throughout history.
It's an easy dismissal of books for children that require children to think for themselves.
I mean, you also got the fact that there's essentially a female protagonist in this book that came out in the 60s, which must have been fairly, amongst sci-fi especially, would have been fairly unique because, I mean, at that time, sci-fi was written almost entirely by men, for men, about men,
right.
And if the women are in there, they're there explicitly for exposition of plot elements. Like, I don't understand what's going on here because I'm a woman. Well, let me explain this to you. You see, we're going to fold space.
And there is a little bit of that in the beginning, because Meg is the dunce who doesn't understand.
Right, and that kind of... that's a good point.
But at the end of the day, she's also is the only one that has the key to save the world.
Yeah.
So she's both. She's the dunce, and she's also... she's the one who gets it in the end. But I think you're right. Like, having a female protagonist and having a female author who wrote this book under her own name. It's not M. Lingle. Like, and I was going to ask you that too, as a boy, speaking for your gender.
I am a boy.
One of the things that librarians and teachers argue about all the time is that in kids' books, male protagonists are better because boys won't read, quote, girl books. And so if you have a male protagonist, everybody will read it. If you have a female protagonist, it gets limited to girls. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's interesting. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it as well. I would have to say that probably as an 11-year-old, being given this book and finding out that there was that I was going to have to read about a girl might have actually been a little bit of a turnoff. And that I try not to judge me too harshly, but, that's it. Thinking back on it, yeah, I could see myself being a little, like, do I really want to read this? And picking up something else. But, I mean, I did read it. I just didn't...
Well, and is that a chicken and egg problem? Like,
well,
is that your problem because you've always been surrounded by books that are interesting to you, that do have male protagonists, probably. And you've been handed them because they're boy books?
Well, also, I'm 11, and at 11, you're still kind of in that mode where, ew, girls.
Right.
Like, you haven't quite reached that cusp where it's like, wait a minute, girls are kind of interesting.
Right.
So, I don't know.
My friend Molly read this to her 3rd through 5th graders, and she gave them a big disclaimer before the kissing scene. It was like, okay, guys, the romance is coming. This is the only romance in this book.
Like, gross.
Like, here it comes. And she read the scene, and they all had their reaction, and then they moved on. But do you think for young boys, having the duo of Meg and Calvin together, having that boy-girl thing helps?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Calvin... I don't find Calvin as interesting as any of the other characters in the book. I feel like he's just kind of the straight man.
He feels a little bit like a drop-in. Like, he feels like he's there to, I don't know, to be a token or to something. Because I feel like Meg and Charles Wallace are perfectly capable of taking this journey on their own, and then suddenly there's Calvin for some reason.
Yeah. So what do you think, from your perspective as a young reader at the, did you enjoy reading books that had male characters in them? I mean, obviously that would probably be more common because, just because of the biases in the literature. But I
feel like I read all kinds of books that had male characters. I can remember reading, I would get old books because my library didn't have any money. So I can remember reading Encyclopedia Brown, and I can remember reading Homer Price and Henry Reed.
Did you if it had a female protagonist or main character, would that have been more preferable?
I think probably my favorite books did have female protagonists. I think the things that I would really list as books that were super, super important in my childhood, the Little House books, which I know you haven't read. Mm-hmm. And Anne of Green Gables, obviously, and Little Women and some of those things did make my favorites list. And I didn't read a lot of sci-fi. My mother actually had to convince me to read this book because she knew I would like it. And she tried to talk me into it for a really, really long time. And my answer was, I don't read sci-fi. And looking back, I don't know, again, is that preference or is that conditioning? Is that I don't read sci-fi because sci-fi is a boy thing? Or was it literally that I just didn't like it? Or that I hadn't found anything in it that I did like? Everybody's talking about this book right now because of the movie. And so I think when I hear from people who this book is a huge part of their childhood, it's usually women. It's usually women who related to Meg. So
I can see that.
It's hard to know about this gendering of books. I really try to, when I'm promoting books to kids, I really try to treat it like a good book is a good book is a good book. And I don't like this idea that books with male protagonists are for everyone and books with female protagonists are for girls. That bothers me. I think it sets up a whole bunch of stuff about masculinity and the culture and everything else. But part of it is you have to have really good books that have girl main characters. And while they exist, I still don't think we're even on that score. So now we get to our last question. Did you like it?
Yeah, I liked it. I think I'm going to have to go through and read the rest of the books. I think there are 4 others.
Yeah, there are 5 total.
Yeah, and I know I read... Actually, I know I read that probably 10 or 12 years ago, and I definitely read A Swiftly Tilting Planet, but I don't think... For some reason, I didn't bother to check to see what the ordering was on these, in the sense that there is one.
There is one.
But I haven't read A Wind in the Door.
Which is, I think, the next one.
Yes, I think it is too.
But I'm not sure. I'd have to look up. But I'm not sure if they were actually written in order and published in order, or if it was one of those things where
we should have done some research so we could sound like we know what we're talking about.
So we sound like we know what we're talking about.
We're an authority on these books, and we don't know anything. I don't believe that the Mrs. W's make a reappearance in any of those books. Is my understanding.
I'm not sure that they do. I will admit,
which is interesting because you'd think that would be could have been a linchpin for the series of some sort, but all the Murray family obviously is the centerpiece.
Yeah, and you would think that the W women could have been because they appear to be, if not immortal, they at least live a really long time, so they're not going anywhere.
So you gotta wonder what happened to them. They went off on some kind of thing that they were, they had to make a real quick exit, and then, I don't know, where'd they go?
Somebody needs to write that story. I'm sure someone has.
But anyway, I did enjoy the book, and I feel like now I need to reacquaint myself with the rest of them
Are you going to go see the movie?
I assume so.
You also mentioned to me that this is not the kind of movie that your friends would go see. Do you think this is just a kid's movie? Do you think it's going to be...
I think that's probably the impression, I am certain that, certain of my friends will end up going seeing it with their kids.
Yeah.
But it's not the kind of movie where it's like, oh, it's guys' night, let's go see, Wrinkle in Time, because
But there are
unfortunately, I have this feeling I'm going to be dragged to see Ready Player One, which comes out later this month, and that, my friends...
may the odds be ever in your favor.
I'm not... That one,
Because there are certain kids' movies that everybody sees. Like, everybody and their brother saw Harry Potter.
Yeah.
But maybe this one doesn't fall that high on their radar. I feel like I hang out with book people, and all they've been doing for months is talking about this movie, so...
Sure.
Alright, is there anything else you want to say about A Wrinkle in Time?
I found the just kind of direct and naked adoption of science in this book. It's just like there's no buts about it. Science is awesome in this book. It's like, and everyone's just like really excited about it and into it, which I find refreshing. There's so much in like this modern world we live in where science is all of a sudden kind of...
And neither you nor I go far enough back to remember the 60s, but I think that's probably the way the culture was back then.
Sure, it's the future. Flying cars, this optimism that science is gonna, is the answer. I don't think that... I think there's kind of this cynicism around it.
And science is not an either-or in this book. It's not a something wins over science. Because we find out, again, spoiler alert, if you're still listening, at the end of the book we find out the answer has been love all along, because that is the thing that this bad, evil essence can't do that Meg can. But there's no science versus love. Science versus emotion. Right. Science versus faith. Science is awesome, and all the emotion, the relationships, the faith, the love, all the other things go on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, science is what, enables all this fancy interstellar, interdimensional travel and all of that sort of thing, but there's also happens to be a god there who maybe thinks science is awesome as well.
That was the one thing that always did bother me about this book, is the idea of a wrinkle in time is explained pretty thoroughly in the 5 dimensions, but then it appears to be something that you just do. There's no machinery, there's no mechanism, there's no anything. It's just, they explain to you how it's done, and then the people who know how to do it just do it.
I appreciate that to a certain extent. It's like, what... The instant you try to explain some kind of magic or science, it never lives up to the kind of thing that you would think of in your imagination. I feel like that's a failing in a lot of, like, for example, horror books or sci-fi novels. But the horror books, it's like they describe some kind of horrible thing that's happening, and and you just kind of learn about in bits and pieces. And then when finally at the end, like toward the end of the book, the monsters reveal, it's like, well, that's not nearly as exciting as what I was expecting it to be. Or this dystopian future that you're plotting out here turns out to just be, oh, well, it's just a bunch of guys being mean to each other. It's like there's if you just say, well, he learns how to test her, it's like, okay, you don't necessarily need to explain that in great depth, because it's essentially, I don't know, it's like just magic.
And when I was classifying this book, I put it in both sci-fi and fantasy, because there's a lot of science to it, and there's a lot of respect for science in it, but there's certainly a lot of elements of magic and these fantastical beings and all of that. Like, I don't know how much pure sci-fi I've ever read that doesn't have some elements of that in it.
You get a lot of, like, pure sci-fi is all about the numbers. Mm-hmm. Like, if you read an Asimov novel or whatever, everything, it's like a textbook with characters in it. But any this is a softer sci-fi with more fantastical elements to it. So it's kind of not everything needs to be explained in great detail. It just is what it is. It's like Star Wars. There. See, now I've gone and ruined it. I've mentioned Star Wars.
No, I was thinking the same thing. Star Wars. I have always thought Star Wars is more fantasy than sci-fi.
So in Star Wars, no one explains how a lightsaber works. No one's sitting down saying, well, there's there's this battery in here, and there's some crystals, and then light gets turned into blah blah. It's just, and then they're attacking each other. It's like, okay, that's cool. That's my analogy for the whole Tesser thing. It's just you just do it.
It just does. Who's your favorite fantastical being in this book?
I think Ant Beast is.
Me too.
Is kind of cute.
I like Ant Beast. A hard one to portray on film, I predict.
That one's going to be interesting. There's going to be some things in there that are going to be. They're going to have made some changes.
It's a pretty quick read, though. I think they're going to be able to get all of it in a 2-hour movie or 2.5 hours or whatever it is, because, like you say, it doesn't have a lot of exposition, and I mean, I read this basically in 2 nights. It goes fast.
Yeah.
So, all right. Any closing thoughts?
I think I'm good.
Thank you.
I've embarrassed myself enough already.
Thank you for coming to talk A Wrinkle in Time with me. Thank you for letting me force you to read this book. I'm giving it back to you because I'll lose it.
All right, here it is.
You can come talk about books with me anytime.
All right.
I love you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Love you too.
I really hope you enjoyed this visit of Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. Took a couple extra days to get this episode to you. Hope it was worth the wait. I think we are going to move our release days to Mondays. Trying to keep up with this weekly schedule is going to be easier for me if I have the weekend to work on it. So we're releasing this on a Monday, God willing, and the creek don't rise. And I think we're going to stick with Mondays for the foreseeable future. As always, reading along is never required, and I hope you'll pop in for a little bit of literary chat. But if you are reading with us, you are once again in luck because I have 2 short ones for you for next week. Next week, we're going to continue Women's History Month with Little Leaders by Vashti Harrison and A Wreath for Emmett Till by Marilyn Nelson. Both pretty short, both dealing with African American history. So I hope you will tune in while we take a look at those and how we convey tougher issues to kids. In the meantime, you may always find us on social media. I am at No Extra Words on Instagram, on Twitter. I love to make new Goodreads friends at goodreads.com/noextrawords. That always gives you a sneak peek of what I am working on for the future. And you can always find show notes and more details at noextrawords.wordpress.com. I hope wherever life takes you this week, you find yourselves a good story.